right, you guys, today we're going to learn about one of the most important joints for mobility in the body, which is the hip. So yoga is really an amazing physical practice because it encourages mobility. We explore the entire range of motion of the hip joint, which is really, really, really cool. That's one of the perks of this practice is that we do external rotation, we do internal rotation, we do flexion, we do extension. We get to move the hips in all directions. So today we're going to learn about the structure of the pelvis. We're going to look at the muscles that work on the hip and how these muscles, we're going to feel how they actually work in the asana practice. And understanding the anatomy of the hip is really going to give you a great foundation for understanding movement in different kinds of yoga postures. So you'll be able to look at yoga postures and say, oh, the hip is an external rotation, or the hip has this kind of action. And that's going to help you in other things like sequencing and putting poses together in a really well-constructed way for your students. Cool? All right. All right, so what's the hip? What is the hip exactly, anatomically, everybody? What do you think? Ball and socket what? Joint. So here's the thing. It's a little bit like our, kind of casual language versus anatomical language, is that we usually say hip. This is the hip. So in kind of layman's parlance, it's kind of like this general area. Put your hands on your hips. Am I putting my hand on my hip joint? Dear God, I hope not. Right? So anatomically, the hip is the ball and socket joint between your pelvis and your femur. So just when we're speaking anatomically, that's what we're speaking specifically about. So what is the purpose of the hip joint? What does it help us do? Move, locomote, walk, right? Cover distance. And it's also a site of weight, of transmission of force from the upper body to the lower body. It moves down through the hip joint and then up. All the joints do that, but upper body to lower body and then the floor up to the upper body. So it's the connection point between the thighs and the rest of the upper body and the pelvis and the spine. So we're going to look at some of the important structures of the pelvis. So the pelvis is that weird bony thing. It's look at it. Look at how weirdly shaped it is. It's so strange looking. We kind of take it for granted, but it's very, very odd shaped. So the pelvis provides structure and stability. It contains the hip joint, which is the ball and socket joint between the femur and the pelvis. Distributes or transfers the weight between the upper body and the lower body. And there's also a bit of a protective quality here in terms of its shape and its ability to protect some of the lower abdominal organs like the bladder, the uterus. So when you look at these two pelvi, which one's a girl and which one's a boy? Take a look. So we vote this one is the boy and this one is the girl. And why do you think that? Childbearing. Does anyone want to squeeze a baby out of here? No thanks. Anybody want to squeeze a baby out of here? No thanks. No thanks. Yeah, but women usually have wider pelvi because of childbirth, exactly. And so men usually are narrower and deeper. So there's something called the Q angle, the quadricep angle, which is the angle of the quadricep. And this is the angle that you draw from this bone on your pelvis, your hip point, to the patella. And so who would have a bigger Q angle? Who would have a more angled Q angle? Well, if I'm a woman, and my pelvis is bigger, is my Q angle going to be steeper or less steep? It's going to be more steep. So imagine this, if I'm a boy, right, and my pelvis is more narrow, then the angle from here to here is going to be more of a straight line. But the wider my pelvis gets, the more this is going to go down like this. Does that make sense now? Yeah. So this is an interesting thing. They call it the obstetrical dilemma. Do you know how babies are born kind of half-baked? Okay, think of a horse baby. A horse baby gets born, gets out, pretty soon is walking around. Human baby gets born. It takes a good year. Takes a while. It's pretty much jello. So it's like they actually call the fourth trimester the first 3 months out of the body. So here's the thing though, if women's pelvi were big enough to accommodate that size of a baby, then we couldn't walk. So that's why babies are born half-baked, little half-baked babies, okay? But the thing is that there's a reason that women have women will have more knee problems than men because of this oblique angle, which is interesting, right? And so, like, if you think of a marathon runners don't tend to be curvy, wide pelvis people, because that doesn't probably feel good in their body as much. Your marathon runners tend to be like very rectangular, because that's like if you're going to run for a long period of time, it's just biomechanically that's a little easier in terms of the forces in your body. So when we practice yoga, I guess where I draw the link for this for us is to think about Tadasana. Traditionally, when I say traditional, I mean Iyengar Ashtanga, is taught with the feet together. This is Tadasana. And yet, how do we usually do Tadasana in our classes now? Hip distance apart. Do a lot of women practice yoga? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so maybe this is a little bit nicer, more forgiving for a woman's body than having to bring the feet together like this. So it's an interesting thing to think about. Like when we bring our feet together in Tadasana, I have to internally rotate my legs slightly. I'm not just standing in total neutral anymore. So it's kind of like now in the last, 10, 15 years, we've started doing Tadasana more with the feet hip distance apart, which I think can sometimes be just slightly more accessible for a female population, which may have a wider pelvis. Now, that isn't a given. Like I've seen a skeleton where you're like, is that a boy or a girl? So it's not like all women have wider pelvi and all men have, but it's as a general thing that tends to be the case. But interesting to think about for Tadasana, right? All right, so let's look at the bones of the pelvis. So there are 3 bones of the pelvis. They're fused by the time you reach adulthood. The ilium, repeat after me, ilium. The ischium. And then the pubis. Yeah, and where these 3 bones connect, this is the hip socket here, is the hip socket. And we'll look at it from a different angle in a second. So here you go, you can see it from the side, the front, and then the side. This is the ilium, the ischium, which sometimes you might have heard the phrase ischial tuberosities, which never, I heard it, I used to hear it all the time, but that's your sitting bones basically. And then the pubis is in the front. And these 3 bones connect here, and this is the hip socket, right? So here you can see how, and we'll look at this a little bit more later, we have the sacrum here, but here's the ilium, the ischium, the pubis. And here's that little pubis symphysis. It's a little cartilaginous disc that kind of provides a little rubber stopper between those bones impacting each other. So let's talk about the SI joint, the sacroiliac joint. So like in many things in anatomy, the name tells you what it is, sacrum, and this is the ilia, so sacroiliac joint, place where 2 bones meet, right? Makes sense? So this is an interesting joint. It is a joint of stability primarily. I'd say not mobility. And it is, you can't see it here, but it is covered in ligaments. It's just like, wow, so much. So what's a ligament again? Next muscle to bone. Close. Or bone to bone. Bone to bone, yes. It's connective tissue that straps bone to bone to stabilize it. It's like packing tape, strappy packing tape. So some small movement is necessary for the SI joint to work properly. When we walk, there's a little bit of movement. It can go like this, it can go a little bit like this. And it is stabilized by something we call form closure and force closure. So let me tell you what those are. So form closure is the actual shape of the joint itself. So where these 2 bones connect, it's like little ears, and they kind of like, it's like a little puzzle piece, and they lock into each other. So that helps to stabilize it. And then also those ligaments help to stabilize it. But also, like any joint, it can be stabilized by muscular action. Force closure, so when the muscles around your hips contract and hug in, then it'll kind of slurpee those things together a little bit. I know. Sound effects, it'll slurpee together a little bit more. So the joint needs to be stable, but not locked. And one of the things that I used to notice a lot in my yoga classes was that I'd have a lot of people coming in with SI joint problems. And I think in part that's because early on in the yoga practice, we do so much hip opening in yoga that there's a lot of kind of an asymmetrical work that I think that there's a lot of, there can be more perhaps than usual movement here. Like more mobility asked of the pelvis. And this is a total hypothesis. I have no proof. But I suspect that the yoga practice, if you have an SI joint instability, that the yoga practice could exacerbate that because it's asking for a lot of movement. And sometimes we're not always cautious about stabilizing, lifting your pelvic floor, hugging your inner thighs together, hugging your outer hips in. So if we just are mobile for, not for just a day, but for years and years and years and years and years, and asking people to do these hip openers, then that might tend to exacerbate a mobile problem. Jen?
So would it be fair to say then that people have like this chronic SI issue? It would be an overstretching perhaps of the ligamentation there?
It could be. It could be that the ligaments have gotten kind of overstretched and then aren't holding everything stable anymore.
Like your ankle sprain.
Yeah, like an ankle sprain, exactly. So someone who comes to me and says that they have SI joint, first of all, SI joint, I'd send them to Lucky, because I'd be like, go see a physio, because I can't possibly know exactly what's going on. And people will have referred pain in their hips, like they'll say it hurts here, and you're like, I don't know where that could be. I don't know. Maybe it's from your shoulder. Like, it's much more complex than just like it hurts here, therefore. But if someone says SI joint stuff to me, just as a cautionary thing, I'll say, like, let's have stability then, right? Lift your pelvic floor, make sure that you're hugging your outer ankles in, try to keep your pelvis stable rather than allowing things to free flow. Like, that's kind of like my conservative yoga teacher suggestion for someone who might be working with something like that. And then I'd send them to a physio. Have you seen a physio? Mm-hmm. All right. So, okay, come on, stand up. Let's stand up. Let's feel our pelvis, these bones here. And I'm just going to flip back to the previous slide so that you can see what you're doing. So take your hands to your own waistline and then press down. Yeah, so you can feel and see if you can trace the shape of your own ilium. Right? And so you can feel the front hip bone here. This is like the most sticky outy point, called the anterior superior iliac spine. You can kind of walk it down. And then take your hand to your own sacrum. So slide your hand down the back of your own pants and bring your middle finger to your own tailbone. It's much higher than you think. Do not go too far. Do not search too deeply. But honestly, it's shocking because the tailbone, it was surprising to me, the tailbone is much higher than your sitting bones. It's kind of like, oh, I didn't know. Okay, now come lay down on your backs. Bend your knees. Bend your knees, place your feet flat on the floor, close your eyes. And then take your hands again to your front hip points. Okay, and walk your hands down to your pubic bone. So the front of your pelvis, and you might be able to even feel a little ridge there where your pubic symphysis is. It's like a little dip. It might even be sore sometimes. Okay, and then draw your right knee into your chest. Don't worry, everybody, I'm not looking at you. Draw your right knee into your chest and bring your right hand underneath you and feel your sitting bone. And then take your left hand back to your pubic bone and walk your hands towards each other so you explore the underside of your pelvis. Many of you may never have done this before.
Not with a group of people. No.
In the privacy of your own home. Okay, do the other side just to feel. So you get to feel like the underside of your pelvis. You get to feel those bones. Good, and then come on up. So we talked about skeletal variation before, which is that bone shape will make you, kind of the shape of the joints. A joint is a place where two bones meet. The shape of those articular surfaces will in part determine what kind of movement is possible in that shape. So here's a picture of our pelvis again with it's just so amazing how different we are with the joint facing forward as opposed to the joint facing out to the side. So what I'd like you to do is let's get into pairs and look at our warrior two. And so what you'll do, she's quite square, right? But that's not typical. So if I kind of pop up here, I'm going to do a baby warrior two. So here, I'm going to do a wimpy warrior two. But here's my hands on my pelvis. If I bend my knee, and I let my pelvis stay like neutral. So in other words, I'm not going to let it tip, or I'll let it turn a little bit side to side. And I'll bring my knee, in fact, I'll let my pelvis turn quite forward here for a moment. Bring my knee over my ankle, here's my thigh, so you can kind of get a sense of where my hip socket might be. And then I will turn my pelvis, keeping my knee, my thigh here as it is. I'm not gonna let this guy move. I'll turn my pelvis forward and backward until I find the end range of my own movement in the joint here, right? So for me, the max I can get in my warrior two, and then you can bring your hands on your hip points like this, is here. This is it. If I tried to square my pelvis, it's gonna just pull my knee in because my joint, like it hits the end of my joint, does not go. So I want you to get into partners and just explore where your warrior two, where your pelvis needs to be as opposed to where your partner's is. And keep in mind, this is just one way of looking at it. Like the amount of rotation you have in your pelvis depends on whether your leg is bent or straight. But in warrior two, because we do this pose so much, it's useful to take a look at what we got. All right, so off you go. As a way of exploring what your pelvis does when it's neutral, one of the compensations that we tend to do here is drop the pelvis forward and extend in the lower back, which is not what we're going for. So what I'll tend to have people do is to find the bowl of their pelvis, like imagine that your pelvis is like a bowl filled with something delicious, like, I don't know, tequila. And then as you keep your back leg straight, so this back leg stays in Tadasana and you bend your knee to a square. So my tendency here would be to do this. Right, but instead of doing that, I'm going to explore like, okay, what is the actual range of motion here if I don't let my pelvis do that and I'm only looking at this joint. So keeping this, then I'll turn my pelvis open and press the back leg to straight. These are the dual actions. Press the inner thigh back, wrap the sitting bone down. Here they are, right here, right? And then if I feel like a nice stretch here, great. If I feel some sort of compression or crunchy, that means something's hitting and that's not great. So I'm doing my best to turn the pelvis open. So one of the benefits of these poses, warrior two, triangle, Parsvakonasana, like we were talking about, is that I'm working my hip into this external rotation and I'm working my external rotators. I'm strengthening these muscles. So that's really great. So I don't want to lose that. But at the same time, I don't want to compromise my knee or hyperextend in my low back in order to get that. So I'm just working in my own personal kind of range. And that's why the dual actions here are so helpful. As you press the thigh back and wrap the sitting bone down, you're kind of finding this little weeble wobble between these opposing forces, between these opposing muscular actions. So as a yoga teacher, I don't cue square your hips to the side of your mat because only like 2% of my students can do that. What I will say is, keeping your thigh steady, turn your pelvis towards, like as a direction of open your pelvis towards the side of your mat to whatever extent you can, right? And then we kind of work there individually. So that's kind of how I try to, again, best practice, capture the majority of the students in the room without trying to cue to an aesthetic. And this is the same for all those poses, you guys. Oh, and the other thing I want to mention is, if my pelvis is like this, the back thigh, the back foot, shin, thigh are all turned in that same direction. Tadasana, right? So here I am. This is how much external rotation I have in this leg. So that's why we turn the back thigh in, because if my pelvis is forward and my thigh is turning straight out, that means this leg is starting to be in external rotation relative to my pelvis. Does that make sense?
So wrap the sit bone back?
The front sitting bone down. So what I do is, that's why we turn the back heel back in Warrior Two. Now, if you're Tiffany and you can be totally square and that works for you, then you might have the toes pointed straight forward because that's the back leg in Tadasana.
And does the upper body track to?
You do add a twist. So I actually like to practice my Warrior Two, honestly, like this. I like to be offset.
Yeah.
So I keep my torso.
Because I find if the torso is then twisted to straight, I feel too much of a
Yeah.
like a pull up top.
It's a twist. It's a twist from the ribs to be, right, whatever. But I kind of do airplane here. And then if I want to add a twist, then I'm aware that I'm adding the twist. That's such a good point, Cher. Yeah. All right, so I want to go through the muscles of the hips so we have a sense of where they are. But here's something that's important. Everyone stand up for a sec. So the hip is a ball and socket joint, which means it moves in lots of different directions. Now, this is the front of the hip, right? And so again, remembering from our course on muscles, if I have a muscle that crosses this, the front of my hip, what is the action that it's going to do on the thigh? Yeah, it's going to contract and it's going to pull these points closer. Everyone lift your leg up, right? Can you see how these points get closer together? So any muscle that crosses the front, you already know what it's going to do. What is this anatomical action called? Do you remember?
Contraction.
Well, it is a contraction.
Are you talking about
Flexion. Do you guys remember flexion? Flexion. So flexion, this is flexion of the hip. So you know any muscles, if you look at a picture of a like human with muscles, you're going to be like any muscles that here, that's going to have this action, right? Any muscle that runs from the back of my leg down, what's that going to do anatomically? Exactly, it's going to take my leg into extension, or the hip into extension. Any muscles which are on the outside of my leg, like here, what's that going to do to my leg? Abduction, abduction. Remember abducted by aliens? Any muscle what's on the inside of my leg like this, that's going to bring my thigh back in. Adduction, that's right. And if I have oblique muscles, like muscles that go diagonally, that's going to externally rotate my thigh. And then if I had, the adductors actually usually internally rotate. So just by knowing which kind of compartment of muscles we're talking about, you guys know what they do. So I just want to demystify that. Don't get too caught up in the names, but instead let's sort of take this in as where is that muscle and what is that actually going to do? And it's fun for us as yoga teachers to think about, if I know that these muscles on the front of the pelvis are what actually contract the thigh and bring it here, I know that if I take my leg back, which muscles are now getting stretched? If I take my leg back behind me, if this is contracted and I take them back, then now these muscles are getting a stretch, right? Which is high lunge and all that kind of stuff. So just by knowing where the muscles are, you know what's going to make them contract and work, what's going to make them shorten, and what's going to make them stretchy and longer, which is useful for sequencing. So let's dive in. We'll dive in one compartment at a time. So let's look at the muscles on the front of the pelvis, the front of the hip first. Has anyone heard of the psoas? The psoas. The psoas is such a cool muscle because it attaches to your lumbar spine. So it runs from the back of your body, so the front of your spine, it runs from there forward, down, and across. So it connects upper body to lower body, but also back to front. And the fibers, it's a really crazy muscle because we can't see it. It's not like our quads because it's so deep. So we're kind of like, where is that, right? But you can imagine it. So everybody stand up for a sec.
It's like KT tape. It's like,
yeah.
your little cat.
So take take your left leg back and come into a short lunge. And bend your back knee so that you can get your pelvis upright. Now I want you to imagine for a moment here in the right side of your waist, the back of your spine, you can bring your hand to your lumbar spine because it's right in front of that. Imagine this muscle running down and forward and attaching to your inner thigh. Okay? So just kind of take that in, all right. And then when we sit down a little deeper now, go ahead and straighten your back leg and feel, so turn your back heel up if you can. Yeah. So, and feel what happens to your low back. Did you guys feel how it pulled in? Okay, so the psoas is attached up there, and so my thought is that the psoas is actually pulling your low back a little bit forward because it's avoiding the stretch here, right? So what I want you to do instead is bend your back knee again. Draw the sides of your waistline back so you feel the back of your body full, so you're keeping the top of the psoas back, and then keep that as you stretch your back leg to straight. Actually, sorry, we're on the left side here. So draw the left side of your navel back and in as you stretch the back leg to straight. And then you're going to feel the stretch across the whole front of your left hip. You guys feel that? Good. Now if you let your butt go back, that stretch eases off, doesn't it? But if you lengthen your sitting bones down and pull your navel back and in, then it will intensify that stretch. Do you guys feel?
So does this shorten the psoas muscle?
In the front leg, that's shortened. The back leg, it's lengthening.
So the warrior one pose would be shortening your
Lengthening your psoas.
length.
Yes. So the psoas runs from here to here, right? So this is contracting and shortening, this one. And this one from the sides of my, like right from here from my lumbar spine to the inner thigh, this is lengthening. And so it's stretching open. So the more that I draw this back and in, pulls the top fibers back. And this, the more I send the inner thigh back, stretches the bottom part. So the moral of the story is that when we're doing our high lunge, right, part of stretching the psoas out is actually getting the waistline back because it starts way up here. Does that make sense? It's like the big one that we can't always access because it's so deep inside our body, so we're not so aware of it just because it's not so superficial. So, what are some poses that contract the psoas that make it work? Can you think of any?
Malasana.
Yeah. Squat.
Chair pose.
Chair pose. Which one?
But anytime you move your body.
Oh.
To knee or just.
Oh yeah, Utthita Hasta. I'm like UHB, Utthita Hasta Padangusthasana. Like Malasana, like Angeline's Malasana, Bakasana, squeezing in, because you're actually hugging it and pulling up too. Navasana. Right? Do you guys feel you're like in here? Right? Because this is holding. What are some poses that stretch the psoas? Camel, yes. High lunge, warrior one.
Would dancer's pose get in there?
Yeah, for sure. With the back leg. Yeah, what's that? Floor bow, yeah, floor bow. So your back bends mostly are asking for the psoas to be open. Good thing to keep in mind when we're preparing our students for back bends is that this needs to be long in order to do it effectively. All right. So another hip flexor is called rectus femoris. It's one of your quads, so it's the only quad. Most of your quads are on your thigh and run to the front of your shin. This is the one that runs all the way to the top of your hip. And so this is the one that when you lift your leg up and you extend it out and you feel the little biting, you're like, ah! It's because when a muscle is very contracted, it'll start talking to you a little bit more loudly. So when I fully am bringing this into its most contracted position here, this muscle will start to go like, what are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? It'll start to talk. So that's rectus femoris that you're feeling because it's like really working hard. Sartorius runs from your hip point down to the inner knee. And this is called like the tailor's muscle. I've heard stories it's because, you know, tailors sit cross-legged and this is a muscle that helps you open the thigh and sit cross-legged. So it's a long, I love it, it's very elegant. It's a long muscle that runs down to the inside of your leg. And those help, right, to do that. That's it, that's all we got. Well, there's one more actually.
So those are all your hip flexors?
Yes.
Okay.
There's one more, and I'll just show you on a previous slide here for a moment. There's one called iliacus. Remember how this is called the ilia? So iliacus is like attached to the inside lip of this and it runs down and usually it attaches with psoas to the inner thigh and it helps psoas do its thing. They work together, but it doesn't attach to the spine like psoas does. So iliacus is another one just to mention, but that's it. And that covers the whole front compartment here. So this is daily life. Right? And so if you think of the hip flexors, when we sit, oftentimes people will do this. Right? And so we're kind of like shortening all of this up. So yoga, when we do poses that stretch this, I think is really helpful for people who have to like sit during the day. And most people don't sit up, you know. And even if they are, their legs are still in flexion a lot of the time. So I think it's very... So the crescent poses and the lunges, which we so frequently do in yoga, I think are a nice antidote to the daily life.
Spiritual heart-opening stuff.
And spiritual heart-opening stuff too. Open your heart. All right, so let's move on to the hip extensor. So we're going to move on to the back of the leg. So the one that you're probably very familiar with is gluteus maximus, right, which is a nice big old power muscle. So go ahead and stand up, everybody. Here's the thing about the glutes. So the glutes will extend the thigh at the hip. So lift your right leg up, take it back behind you, and squeeze your ass. Squeeze it. So not only does it take your leg back, what's happening to your back leg?
It's shortening.
Yes, but what's happening?
Extension?
Yes, extension, but there's another action too. Not only is extension happening, but what else is your thigh bone doing? It's rotating. It's rotating outwardly, right? That makes sense because your glutes are diagonal. So it's going to take the leg back, but it's also going to try to pull in, right? It's going to try to squeeze in and open the thigh, which is why when you do poses, when your glutes want to work and you're doing a pose like Warrior 3, you're like, why am I always trying to open my hip? It's because your glute wants to pull and contract and support you.
Why does mine not do that?
I don't know, you've down-trained it so much probably. So this is also why when you're doing a back bend like bridge or wheel, right? When you're lifting your hips up, your legs want to externally rotate.
Oh, yeah.
Do you guys make sense? That's why everyone's like squaring your feet, squaring your feet. And when you bring your legs back in something like Shalabhasana, right? We want to open the leg. Everyone's like, roll your inner thighs up. So there's a debate. Is it bad to squeeze the glutes? So what? So your leg opens up. Who cares? Who cares? I personally love using my ass and squeezing my glutes. I love it. For me, that feels more stable. And ballerinas do it all the time. However, for some students, that can feel compressive in the low back. Yoga as a system of movement tends to prioritize being parallel. For better, for worse. That's kind of, it's like, Tai Chi, or it's like ballet is always external rotation, right? Yoga tends to be neutral. I am of the mind, so our best practice would be, okay, let's use the glutes, but let's not overly use them. But I just want you guys to know that your glute is a big powerhouse of a muscle. So, I don't know, I think there's a time and place where your glutes can be useful, even in yoga. Even in yoga. So in big back bends, what tends to happen, like in a bridge pose, which you saw with my legs coming out, if I come into wheel, I actually do prefer my legs to be neutral, to be parallel to each other. Because if I externally rotate, sometimes that can create, I don't get quite as much extension through my low back. So again, it's kind of a debate. There it is, but that's why everyone likes to externally rotate their legs when we're lifting up in Warrior 3. It's because your glute is trying to be so super helpful. And when you have to neutrally, when you turn your leg down, it deactivates the glute to some extent. The glute isn't working at its full contraction because you're now taking it out of external rotation.
And it's also about balance too, right? Like you don't want to overuse your glutes
Yes.
and not use your internal rotators.
Yes.
So you want to find the balance. I think that's the biggest thing. It's not about just overusing it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I think anatomically too, like for some people, depending on their ability to rotate, like that is just really unnatural. You can tell for some people.
I know. Yeah, so this might be where it comes down to us considering best practices. So looking for balanced action in the body, like a balance between the glutes working and the internal rotators working to find stability in your leg. But then also at some level, looking at the individual. And if they're super unhappy trying to be neutral, then maybe it's okay if they're a little externally rotated. Maybe we don't have to run to fix that necessarily. So it becomes a more complicated question. Like I for one am a huge fan of turning my standing leg out slightly. So when I do like Warrior 3, I actually turn my standing leg out just a tiny bit because I find that gives me a lot more stability than being totally neutral. So I cheat at yoga. All right. So we looked at this in bridge pose. That's why the thighs like to externally rotate. So we usually balance that with the neutrality. Again, Warrior 3, same thing. You lift the back leg up, it wants to externally rotate. Balancing that with the other muscles of the leg to keep it neutral. That's what we tend to do in yoga. And I think that's good, So the hamstrings are the long muscles on the back of your leg that run from your ischial tuberosity. But unlike your glutes, your hamstrings cross two joints. So they cross the hip, but then they also run and they cross the knee. So not only do your hamstrings take the leg back behind you, but because they cross the knee, they can also bend the leg. So sometimes if you do both of those actions at the same time, you get a Charlie horse in the back of your thigh. You're like, wow, why is it biting me? It's because muscles, when they fully contract, they're gonna complain to you. They're gonna be like, we don't like to be this contracted. So, if you're ever doing this pose, right? This pose, and you're like, ow, right? It's because your hamstrings, all of a sudden, you're saying, go to your fullest contraction. Pull as short as you possibly can. And sometimes they're like, no, no thank you. So that's why. So the hamstrings are often tight in people. Again, we had this good conversation yesterday, like some people have long hamstrings, right? But many of our students come, and if they've been like this, desks, things like that, that this starts to pull the pelvis under, right? And so in yoga, we're looking for balanced action, inner thighs back and tailbone down. And we do a lot of hamstring lengthening poses in yoga, which can be helpful for people who are overly tight in the backs of their legs. And when you see this in Dandasana, like you'll see the same thing manifesting in staff pose. Let's all sit in this pose for a sec. Okay. Extend your legs out. So here's the thing about the hamstrings. I want you to visualize this for a moment. Feel your sitting bones into the floor, your butt bones, if you will, and imagine your hamstrings going down to the backs of your legs. So some students will be here, because if their hamstrings are tight, this is tight, it's pulling their pelvis under. So one solution would be to sit them up on a block or sit them up on something, which will decrease the intensity of this angle. But another thing that you can do, and this is why this works, is to bend the legs. Because when you bend the knees, you unlock the hamstrings here and create more space, which will let them actually get taller through their spine. So the hamstrings are why we bend the knees, to find more spinal length in poses that are like forward folds. Does that make sense? You bend the knees, the hamstrings unlock, and then you got more room. So that's it. So we've covered the front, we've covered the back. So we looked at the front, the psoas, the rectus, the sartorius, these muscles here, and now we looked at the hamstrings and the glutes, the back of the pelvis. So let's take a look at the adductors. Now, you guys, you don't need to know all the different adductors. There's like 5 of them, but they're really useful in stabilizing. So whenever you hear the cue, squeeze your thighs together, scissor your inner legs, hug the feet towards each other. All of those cues are activating the adductors, which run along the inside of your leg and work to hug everything in. So they work to adduct the legs, and they also work to internally rotate them a little bit. So these are the guys that counteract your glutes from externally rotating. And any muscles here, we tend to move in this plane, don't we? We tend to move in the sagittal plane. So when we're moving in the sagittal plane, it's the muscles on the insides of your legs and the outsides of your legs that are stabilizing you to permit this movement. It's like otherwise we'd be like kind of all over the place, right? So these muscles almost work to create an opportunity for movement forward and backwards.
So squeeze the thighs in together, hug the body into the midline.
Correct. That's going to engage your adductors. Hugging it. And we use it all the time in poses like lunges, crescent pose, anytime we're squaring the hips, anytime we're trying to counteract the action of the glutes by rolling the inner thighs towards each other. Hugging the inner thighs in, pressing the upper inner thighs back engages the adductors. You can feel it. So stand up for a sec. Press down through your feet. Feet hip distance apart and parallel. And now, old bones. Okay, and now squeeze your feet towards each other. Squeeze them in. Squeeze them in. Do you guys feel the inner legs fire up? Yeah. There you go, they're your adductors. Right? And they're all different lengths. You got a bunch of them. So some are short, some are long, some are a little bit more on the back of your leg. Yeah. So the abductors, we're going to flip right into the outer hip. So stay standing and press your heels wide. Bring your hands onto your outer hips and try to press your heels away from each other. Do you feel your outer hips fire up? Oh yeah. So these guys, you got glute medius, they're fan-shaped muscles here. And so glute medius and glute minimus, mini-me, is underneath it. And the front fibers are a little here, middle fibers here, back fibers here. And anytime you have a fan-shaped muscle, not only do these guys stabilize the hips, so they're gonna pull the foot out like this, or so when I press my feet wide here, but they also can turn the thigh a little bit. So if I have fibers running this direction, they can turn in. These guys are right out. These guys can pull back a little bit. A little fan-shaped muscle. So not only does this keep you pressing your thighs out, but say I'm like sitting like this. Okay, so everyone hang out like a teenager for a moment. Okay, so if my muscle is running here to here, the muscle that pulls this in are going to be the abductors, right? So they actually stabilize you by pulling in. So imagine for a moment that you're a marathon runner, okay? You're running. We don't want to let the hips do this, do we? Usually unless we're doing dancercise, right? So runners, because they want to focus their force straight ahead in this line, they don't want it to dissipate out to the sides, their outer hips are working all the time to hug them in so that all of their force can go forward. So that's why runners, when they come into yoga practice, are like, my hips are so tight. It's because these guys are working to hug in all the time to keep them from sashaying, right? So your abductor.
Run with a wiggle then?
You should not run with a wiggle.
No.
That is inefficient. But it does mean that these guys are used to working and being stabilizers. So because they're working and they're stabilizing, they're going to get tighter, more contracted.
That's why runners cannot get into pigeon.
That's why runners cannot get into pigeon. Okay, so, all right, so these muscles are also important for in one-legged balancing poses. So when I'm on one leg, the outer hip often has to work to really gather and to stabilize you. So if I'm ever doing like a pose like tree pose or eagle pose, a little less with the eagle pose because you're squeezing in so much, but these kind of one-legged balancing poses here, these guys are working to really kind of keep you from wobbling. So they're really important when we do balancing stuff. Anyway, there's also the tensor fascia lata. Sounds like a Starbucks drink. Bring your hands to the front of your hips. Lift one foot up and then internally rotate it, and you'll feel this little guy pop. You guys feel that? A little, it gets tight. It's a little, it is, right? Lucky, am I right? I'm right. It's like a little, gotta needle that. Just needle it. Okay, so it's a bit of an internal rotator. This little guy, this tensor fascia lata, and your gluteus maximus, this big guy, all connect into the IT band. Okay? It's almost like the IT band is a big tendon for those two muscles and runs to the outer knee. So here's a quick story. Years ago, my knee blew up like a balloon. And I was like, what is going on? I go to my physio. I'm like, what is happening? She took a look at it. She's like, Rachel, your ass is tight. I was like, what? Your ass is tight and weak. Oh no, a tight and weak ass. So what was happening, I'll show you on this side, what was happening is that my gluteus maximus was attaching into my IT band, and it was tight and weak, and it was transmitting force down here and pulling on my knee. So my knee was the victim and yelling at me. It was like, ah, but it was my butt that was the bully, the weak, tight bully. So I had to work on my butt in order to fix my knee. So those things are connected.
So you would have to loosen up your...
I had to loosen up and strengthen my butt. I know. You think that muscles that are tight will be stronger, but they're not. So, all right, so moral of the story is everything's connected. Okay, last little piece. So we've looked at the front, we've looked at the back, we looked at the inside, we looked at the outside. Now we're gonna look at the little guys inside the pelvis that help to externally rotate you. The deep six. It's like a submarine show. The deep six. Oh, is it? All right. So these are a bunch of, and the one that the one that I want you to sort of clock and think about is one called the piriformis. But these guys they're a bunch of little muscles. They look quite large here, but they're little muscles. You don't really need to know about them. They help to stabilize the pelvis, and they also help to externally rotate the thigh. They're little guys. They're kind of like a little sling for your pelvis. The piriformis is interesting. And because the piriformis runs from the back of your sacrum, here you see all those strappy ligaments, runs from the back of your sacrum out to your femur, and usually it runs over or around this big honkin' yellow thing. What do you think that big honkin' yellow thing is? Tendon? No. Good guess though. No, this thing, this yellow stringy thing?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, you're right, this thing is a bone. What's this long yellow thing?
A vein?
That looks like a tendon. Veins would be red. It is your sciatic nerve.
Oh, ew.
It is that big.
Oh, God.
It is huge.
Wow, I had no idea.
It is huge, you guys. You can see it. It's huge. It looks like a big tendon, right? Just so. So it has a few nerves bundled in it. So here's the thing is that sometimes people get something called sciatica, okay? Now true sciatica is formed by compression of this big honking nerve by your bones, by your lumbar spine. But the sensation of sciatica can be imitated when the piriformis is squishing the sciatic nerve because it runs right underneath it.
Say that again, sorry.
The symptoms of sciatica can be mimicked when the piriformis contracts and squeezes the sciatic nerve and compresses that nerve, causing numbness and tingling and weakness down the backs of your legs. So that's called piriformis syndrome, something just to clock. Okay. Awesome, you guys. Good.
Is this class 75 or 80?
75, baby.